My wife confessed her darkest secret in Japanese, not knowing I was fluent. I'd been married to Aiki for 3 years when she finally got pregnant, and we were so excited that she broke 10 years of no contact with her mother. "Konnichiwa," her mom exclaimed. "Hey," I responded. The thing is, I spoke fluent Japanese, but I'd always been too embarrassed of my past anime and manga obsession, so I pretended I didn't understand. Her white American dad, Robert, was already setting up a crib. I helped him, and that's when I heard it. From the kitchen, Aiki and her mom were speaking in rapid Japanese. "Matt no kodato itara dusuru?" her mother asked. "What will you do when he finds out it's Matt's baby?" My hand froze on the screwdriver. Aiki laughed. "Kare wa shiranai. Baka dakara. He doesn't know. He's an idiot. You okay there?" Robert noticed I'd stopped working. I let my voice crack. Just emotional, thinking about becoming a dad. I made sure to project my voice toward the kitchen. I've dreamed about this my whole life. From the kitchen, they exploded into Japanese laughter. "Kawaisu. Poor thing. Yume mite iru. He's dreaming." I smirked. You see, I'd watched dozens of cheating stories on TikTok, and I knew the only way out was to let the hoe dig her own grave. The more emotional I appeared, the more free ammunition they'd give me to destroy them. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I accidentally left my laptop open to baby name websites. I made sure they saw me reading parenting books. That weekend, we were watching anime on the couch, and a character made an irresistible pun in Japanese. I couldn't help it. I laughed, the subtitle even appeared. Aiki's head snapped toward me. "Why did you laugh?" Her voice was sharp. I kept my eyes on the screen. "Oh, the physical comedy is funny. The way he fell." "Sorwa hendata," her mother muttered. That was strange. Aiki agreed quietly. "Yeah." A few nights later at dinner, I decided to twist the knife a little. Robert was carving a roast while the women set the table. I said casually, reaching for the potatoes. "I was thinking about downloading Duolingo for Japanese. Would be nice to understand what you and your mom talk about." Aiki's fork clattered onto her plate. "No!" She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "I mean, it's so hard. You'll never learn it. Why waste your time?" The real game began when I got my promotion. "Honey!" I burst through the door one evening, knowing her mom was visiting. "My boss pulled me aside today. He said with the baby coming." I paused dramatically. "I'm getting a $15,000 bonus." Aiki hugged me. "Oh, baby, that's wonderful." But the second I went to check on dinner, I heard the Japanese. "Jugo sendoru. 15,000. Mado hikidasu dekiru. We can extract more." That night, I pushed further. "I've been thinking, maybe I should get a second job. I want our baby to have everything." Aiki's eyes lit up. "Really?" "I could do Uber after work. Maybe sell my gaming collection. Whatever it takes." She quit her job that afternoon, but not before sending a bridge-burning email calling her boss sexist, her co-workers incompetent, and the company a toxic hellhole. She showed me proudly, like she'd done something brave. "Are you sure that was wise?" I asked carefully. "Who cares? I have you." But here's what she didn't know. I'd already found Matt. My private investigator had tracked him down, and he was very interested to know about the baby he'd paid $5,000 to avoid. The family gathering was the masterpiece. I suggested hosting Aiki's extended family for a pregnancy celebration, knowing alcohol would loosen their lips. "Tell them about Matt," her mother urged in Japanese after the third wine. "They'll think it's funny." I busied myself with food, phone recording from my pocket, as Aiki giggled with her cousins about how she was screwing me over. Some laughed, others looked horrified. Her aunt tried to shush her, but Aiki was on a roll. "Mata ninshin shitara, mata onaji koto suru." If I get pregnant again, I'll do the same thing. That's when I made my move. I walked in with appetizers, smiling blankly. "What are you all laughing about? I wish I could understand." The guilty silence was deafening. Several cousins couldn't meet my eyes. "Just girl talk," Aiki slurred, even though we agreed she wouldn't drink alcohol. "About babies?" I asked innocently. "I love baby talk. Even if I can't understand the language, I can feel the joy." That evening, I scheduled a work trip for the following week, then made sure Aiki knew I'd be gone for 3 days. What she didn't know was that I'd be in town, working with my lawyer and the private investigator. Or that the security system I'd surprised her with had audio recording in every room. As I kissed her goodbye, she was already on the phone with her mother, planning Jason's visit, a new boyfriend she had lined up. The next morning, I sat in my car outside a coffee shop, phone connected to my laptop, transferring the audio files to 3 different cloud accounts. My hands shook as I listened again to Aiki's voice saying she'd do it all over if she got pregnant a second time, and I had to pause the playback to breathe through the anger that squeezed my chest. This wasn't just evidence of what she'd done, it was proof of who she actually was, someone who saw me as a resource to exploit, rather than a person to respect. I labeled each file with dates and timestamps, creating a system that would let me find specific conversations later if I needed them. The recording from the family party was the longest, over 2 hours of Japanese chatter that included at least 15 minutes of direct discussion about Matt and the baby. I made notes in a separate document, translating key phrases and marking the exact timestamps where Ike or her mother said something particularly damning. By the time I finished organizing everything, it was almost noon, and my coffee had gone cold. I pulled up Maria Whitaker's number and called her office, my stomach tight with nervous energy about laying all of this out for someone else to examine. She answered on the second ring with a brisk greeting that immediately steadied my nerves. I told her I had recordings from the family party and new information about Jason, and she said to bring everything I had and come by at 3. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like this was just another case rather than my entire life falling apart, and somehow that professional distance made it easier to breathe. I spent the next 2 hours at the coffee shop, reviewing my notes and making sure I could explain the context of each recording without getting too emotional. I needed to present this clearly, show her the pattern of deception rather than just dumping my anger on her desk. Maria's office was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, which felt appropriately unglamorous for the work of documenting betrayal. Inside, the walls were covered with certificates and a few generic landscape photos, and Maria herself sat behind a desk piled with file folders and a laptop covered in coffee rings. She was maybe 50, with short gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and she gestured for me to sit while she pulled out a legal pad. I played her selected clips of the Japanese conversations, pausing after each one to provide my translation and explain who was speaking. She took notes in quick, efficient handwriting, occasionally asking me to replay a section or clarify a phrase. When I got to the part where Ike's aunt tried to shush her at the party, Maria looked up and asked if any other family members seemed uncomfortable with what was being said. I told her about the cousins who wouldn't meet my eyes afterward, and she made a note with a star next to it. Maria set down her pen and explained that while the recordings might not be admissible in court depending on state laws, they were incredibly valuable for building a full picture and identifying potential witnesses. She said judges often viewed secret recordings with suspicion, especially in divorce cases, and we needed to be strategic about what we presented and when. I felt frustration rise in my throat because I'd worked so hard to gather this evidence, but she held up a hand and said that didn't make the recordings useless. They told us who knew what and when, which meant we could build a legal case through texts, financial records, and witness statements, rather than relying solely on surveillance. She suggested we prioritize those legal evidence channels, using the recordings as a roadmap for what to look for, rather than as the evidence itself. I understood the practical wisdom in her approach, even though part of me wanted to just play the recordings in court and watch Ike's face as everyone heard the truth. That evening, I maintained my distant but present act with Ike, responding to her questions about my day with vague answers about work projects and deadlines. She was scrolling through baby furniture websites on her tablet, asking my opinion on cribs that all looked basically the same to me, and I gave responses that were polite but non-committal. Every word she said felt like it was happening in a different reality from the one I was actually living in, like I was watching a play where I knew the ending, but the other actors didn't. She showed me a changing table she liked, and I nodded, thinking about how I'd never actually use any of this furniture. The disconnect between what she thought was happening and what was actually happening made my head hurt, but I kept my face neutral and my voice steady. When she asked if I was feeling okay, I told her I was just tired from the long day, and she accepted that without question. I scheduled a consultation with Wallace Greco for the following morning, a family law attorney Maria had recommended who specialized in complex divorce cases involving paternity disputes. His phone screening had been thorough, asking detailed questions about the timeline of Ike's pregnancy, when I first suspected the affair, and what evidence I'd gathered so far. He'd explained his fee structure clearly and told me to bring copies of our financial statements, the marriage certificate, and any documentation related to the pregnancy. I spent the evening organizing documents into labeled folders, creating a timeline of events that started with Ike's mother coming back into her life and ended with Jason's planned visit during my fake work trip. The clinical act of arranging papers and dates helped me feel like I was taking concrete action rather than just drowning in emotion. Wallace's office was in a downtown high-rise with a lobby that smelled like carpet cleaner and had elevator music playing softly from hidden speakers. His calm professionalism immediately put me at ease despite the circumstances, the way he shook my hand firmly and offered me coffee before we sat down to business. He reviewed my documentation methodically, asking clarifying questions and making notes on his own legal pad. When we got to the recordings, he explained that paternity challenges were most effective when filed immediately after birth, before I signed any birth certificate or acknowledgement of paternity. He warned me that the recordings of Japanese conversations would likely be inadmissible and could even work against me if the judge viewed them as vindictive surveillance. I felt my jaw tighten at that, but he met my eyes and said he understood my frustration. He just needed me to understand the legal reality we were working within. Wallace outlined a filing sequence that started with legal separation, followed by a paternity challenge once the baby was born and DNA results were available. He explained that prenatal paternity testing existed, but courts preferred post-birth testing for legal proceedings, and any testing I arranged now would be for my personal knowledge only. I asked about protecting my finances in the meantime, and he advised opening a separate bank account and documenting all marital expenses. He said that as a spouse before any separation filing, I had the legal right to transfer half of our joint savings into my own account. And I should do that immediately to prevent Ike from draining the accounts once she realized I knew the truth. He also recommended I start tracking every dollar she spent, creating a paper trail that would show her spending patterns and financial dependence. I opened a new bank account that afternoon at a different branch of our bank, where nobody would recognize me and mention it to Ike. I transferred exactly half of our savings, which came to just over $11,000, and felt a grim satisfaction at taking this concrete step. I also started a spreadsheet on my laptop, logging every baby item purchase Ike made, every grocery receipt, every utility bill. The clinical nature of this financial accounting helped me feel like I was building a case rather than just drowning in betrayal. Each number I entered was another piece of evidence, another fact that would support my position when this all came out in the open. I created formulas to calculate her monthly spending and compare it to what she'd contributed when she was still working, building a clear picture of her financial dependence. That evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard Ike on the phone in the living room, speaking in rapid Japanese to her mother. I moved closer to the doorway, pretending to check something in the pantry, and caught her saying something about moving money into her mother's account just in case. My stomach dropped as I realized she was already thinking about hiding assets, which meant some part of her suspected I might know something, or at least sensed that things weren't right between us. I made a mental note to tell Wallace about this conversation at our next meeting and to check our account activity daily for any unusual transfers. The fact that she was already planning defensive moves meant I needed to stay ahead of her, keep gathering evidence and building my case before she had a chance to cover her tracks or prepare her own strategy. I waited until past midnight when Ike was asleep before opening my laptop in the home office. I logged into our router admin panel using the password I'd set up when we first moved in, a password she never knew existed. The connection logs loaded slowly, showing weeks of activity and neat columns of IP addresses and timestamps. I scrolled through the data, looking for patterns, and there it was. Starting 3 weeks ago, there were video calls happening between 11 p.m. and midnight, always after I'd gone to bed. The destination IP address was consistent, the same unknown location every time, and the sessions lasted between 30 and 45 minutes. I took screenshots of every log entry, saving them to a hidden folder on my desktop, then emailed the files to Maria with a brief message asking her to trace the IP and confirm if it belonged to Jason. My hands shook slightly as I hit send, another piece of evidence locked down. Maria's response came the next afternoon while I was at work. The IP address belonged to an apartment complex on the west side of town, and she'd already pulled the resident directory. Jason Martinez, age 28, Unit 3B. She'd run a background check, too. Sales job at a tech company downtown. No criminal record. Single based on his social media profiles where he posted gym selfies and pictures of his dog. I sat in my car during lunch reading Maria's email, trying to process the bizarre triangle I was stuck in. Ike was pregnant with Matt's baby, married to me, and already setting up her next relationship with Jason. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't actively destroying my life. I forwarded Maria's findings to my personal email backup and added Jason's details to the spreadsheet I was keeping. That evening, I searched online directories for therapists who specialized in betrayal trauma and divorce preparation. I found Devora Gray's profile on a counseling website, her credentials listed along with a photo showing a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair. The intake form was detailed, asking about my emotional state, whether I had thoughts of harming myself or others, my support system, my goals for therapy. I filled it out honestly in the parking lot of a grocery store, typing on my phone that I was angry and hurt, but not dangerous. Just desperate for a space to process this situation without falling apart or doing something stupid. I submitted the form and received an automated response that someone would contact me within 24 hours to schedule an appointment. Devora's office called me the next morning, and I scheduled my first session for Thursday afternoon. When the day arrived, I left work early and drove to a small office building near the hospital. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines nobody ever read, the kind of generic professional space that could be a dentist or accountant just as easily as a therapist. Devora met me at the door, shaking my hand and leading me to her office where 2 armchairs faced each other with a small table between them. I sat down and started talking, the whole story pouring out in a rush. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, her face neutral but attentive. When I finished, she asked me what I hoped to achieve through all this evidence gathering. I told her I wanted to expose Ike in front of her entire family, make sure everyone knew what she'd done. Devora nodded slowly and asked whether that would serve my healing or just my anger. The question hit me harder than I expected, sitting in my chest like a weight for the rest of the session and following me home afterward. I didn't have a good answer. Over the next week, I started quietly removing things from the house during my lunch breaks. I rented a storage unit across town, one of those climate-controlled spaces with a rolling door and fluorescent lights. I took my parents' photo albums first, the leather-bound books my mom had kept for decades. Then the letters my dad wrote to my mom when they were dating, stored in a shoebox in our closet. I grabbed a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to my grandparents, small items that fit in my car trunk. Each trip felt like dismantling the life I thought I was building, packing away pieces of my history before they could become collateral damage in whatever confrontation was coming. I photographed everything as I loaded it into the storage unit, creating a digital inventory in case I needed proof later of what belonged to me. Ike noticed the missing wedding photo on Thursday evening. She was dusting the living room shelf when she stopped and looked at the empty space where my parents' photo had sat for 2 years. She called out asking where it went, her voice casual but curious. I walked in from the kitchen and told her I'd taken it to get the frame repaired, that the corner was coming loose and I didn't want it to fall and break the glass. She accepted this explanation immediately, nodding and moving on to dust the next shelf. Her easy acceptance of my lie mirrored exactly how she'd been lying to me for months, and I felt a grim satisfaction at turning her own tactics back on her. The photo was actually in my storage unit, wrapped carefully in bubble wrap and stored in a box labeled with my parents' names. Maria called me on Friday with news about Matt. She'd scheduled a meeting with him using a vague pretext about a legal matter that required his input, not mentioning Ike initially. Matt had agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown on Saturday morning, and Maria invited me to come observe from a distance. I could see his reactions firsthand without him knowing I was there. I agreed immediately, asking what I should wear to blend in. Maria laughed and said sunglasses and a baseball cap would be fine, just sit far enough away that he wouldn't notice me watching. Saturday morning, I arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early and claimed a table 3 rows back from where Maria said she'd sit. I wore my oldest baseball cap and dark sunglasses, a newspaper open in front of me like I was reading. Matt showed up right on time, a tall guy in his early 30s wearing a polo shirt and khakis, looking nervous as he scanned the room for Maria. She waved him over to her table near the window, and I watched them shake hands and sit down. Even from this distance, I could read his body language clearly. At first, he looked confused, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. Then Maria must have mentioned Ike's name because his whole posture changed. He leaned forward, his hands moving to his hair, running through it over and over. His legs started bouncing under the table, that classic nervous tell that people do when they're stressed. He kept shaking his head, his mouth moving rapidly as he talked, and at one point he put his face in his hands. After about 40 minutes, Maria stood up and shook Matt's hand again. He left through the front door, walking fast like he couldn't get away quick enough. I waited 5 minutes before joining Maria at her table, sliding into the seat Matt had just left. She briefed me quickly, keeping her voice low. Matt had admitted everything, the affair, the $5,000 payment, all of it. He said Ike told him she was going to handle it, and he'd assumed that meant either abortion or passing the baby off as her husband's child. He seemed genuinely shocked to learn she was planning to keep the baby, and that I might be discovering the truth. Maria had recorded the entire conversation with Matt's permission, and she said his statements could be valuable evidence if we needed them later. She handed me a business card with a code written on the back, explaining that was the password to access the audio file from her secure server. That night, I stood in our bathroom after Ike had gone to bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror and trying to practice what I'd say when I finally confronted her. I imagined revealing that I spoke Japanese, watching her face change as she realized I'd understood every mocking word. I pictured playing the recordings, showing her the evidence, making her sit through the proof of her own betrayal. But every script I rehearsed felt wrong, either too dramatic like I was acting in a movie, or too weak like I was just whining about my hurt feelings. I couldn't find the right tone, the right words that would convey everything I felt without dissolving into incoherence. I tried different approaches, calm and clinical, angry and accusatory, hurt and betrayed, but none of them felt authentic. After an hour, I gave up and went to bed, lying awake in the darkness while Ike slept beside me, still practicing impossible conversations in my head. Wallace called early the next morning while I was making coffee, and I stepped into the garage to take it. He got straight to business, asking about my plans for the work trip and the security system I'd mentioned. Then he said something that made my blood pressure spike. He told me I needed to be very careful about recording laws in our state because some places require 2-party consent for audio recordings. If we were in a 2-party consent state, everything I'd captured could be illegal, and I could face criminal charges, which would destroy my entire case and possibly land me in jail. I sat down on my toolbox, suddenly feeling sick. The thought that all my evidence gathering could backfire and put me in legal trouble hadn't even occurred to me. Wallace said he'd look into our specific state laws and get back to me within a few hours, but I should hold off on any more recording until we knew for sure. I spent the rest of the morning searching online, reading through legal websites and state statutes, trying to understand the difference between 1-party and 2-party consent. My hands shook as I scrolled through page after page of legal language. Finally, around noon, I found what I was looking for. Our state was a 1-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of or that happened in my own home. The relief hit me so hard I had to put my head between my knees. Wallace called back an hour later to confirm my research, but he added a warning that took some of my relief away. He explained that even though the recordings were legal, judges sometimes viewed them badly if they looked like harassment or setting up your spouse. I needed to be smart about what I recorded and how I presented it in court. The goal was to document genuine behavior, not to trick Ike into saying or doing something she wouldn't normally do. I assured Wallace I understood, and that I'd only use the recordings to capture what naturally happened during my fake work trip. 2 days later, I installed the security system while Ike was at a doctor's appointment. I mounted small cameras in the living room, kitchen, and hallway, each one with audio recording capability, hidden in what looked like regular home security equipment. The whole setup took me about 90 minutes, and I tested each camera twice to make sure the audio quality was clear enough to pick up conversations. When Ike got home, I showed her the new system with what I hoped looked like excited pride. I pulled up the app on my phone and walked her through how we could monitor the house remotely, check the cameras from anywhere, and get alerts if the system detected motion. I explained that with the baby coming, I wanted to make sure our home was as secure as possible, especially when I had to travel for work. She smiled and hugged me, saying it made her feel safer knowing we had this protection. She had no idea she'd just approved her own surveillance. That night during a quiet dinner, Ike suddenly grabbed her stomach and let out a sharp gasp. Her face went pale and she doubled over slightly in her chair. My fork clattered onto my plate as I jumped up, all my anger and planning forgotten in an instant. I asked her what was wrong and she said she was having sharp pains, worse than anything she'd felt before. My hands were already grabbing my keys and her purse as I told her we were going to the hospital right now. I helped her to the car, one arm around her waist while she breathed through what looked like contractions. The drive to the emergency room took 12 minutes but felt like an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white while Ike breathed in short bursts beside me. At the hospital, they got her into a wheelchair and took her straight back to be examined. I paced in the hallway outside her room, my mind racing between concern for her physical safety and the complicated mess of our situation. A doctor came out after about 30 minutes and explained that it was round ligament pain, not labor, a common and harmless condition where the ligaments supporting the uterus stretch and cause sharp pains. They wanted to monitor her for another hour just to be safe, but the baby was fine, and there was no immediate danger. The relief and confusion hit me at the same time, leaving me exhausted. In the hospital waiting room afterward, I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair and watched Ike doze in the seat next to me, her hand resting on her belly like she was protecting the baby, even in sleep. Something shifted in my chest, a confusing mix of tenderness and betrayal that made my throat tight. This was still a person I'd shared 3 years of my life with, someone I'd loved and made plans with, even if that person had never really existed the way I thought. The complexity of feeling both protective and furious at the same time wore me out more than the anger alone ever had. She looked vulnerable and small in the harsh hospital lighting, and I hated that part of me still cared about her well-being despite everything she'd done. Robert called the next afternoon to check on Ike after her mother told him about the hospital visit. I could hear real concern in his voice as he asked if she was okay and if the baby was all right. I gave him the medical update and assured him everything was fine, just a scare. As we talked, I realized with a heavy feeling in my gut that Robert was going to be devastated when he learned the truth. He'd been nothing but kind to me since the day we met, helping with the crib, treating me like family, getting excited about becoming a grandfather. The conversation I'd eventually have to have with him, telling him that his grandson wasn't actually his biological grandson, made me feel sick. He didn't deserve this betrayal any more than I did. 3 days later, I met with Wallace again at his office to finalize the strategy for my fake work trip. He spread out a timeline on his desk and walked me through exactly what should happen during those 3 days. He stressed multiple times that I should not confront Ike during this period, no matter what I saw or heard through the cameras. The goal was pure documentation, letting her reveal her plans with Jason naturally, without any pressure or suspicion from me. Wallace explained that if I confronted her or tried to catch her in the act, it could look like entrapment or harassment, which would weaken our case. I needed to just watch, record, and document everything while maintaining my cover story about being out of town for work. That evening at dinner, I told Ike about my work trip scheduled for the following week. I explained it was a mandatory training session in a city 3 hours away, something my boss had signed me up for months ago that I couldn't get out of. She asked only a couple basic questions about when I'd leave and when I'd be back, then seemed almost relieved as she nodded and went back to her food. That relief stung, but also confirmed everything I already knew. She was already planning how to use those 3 days, already thinking about Jason's visit, already looking forward to my absence. The night before my fake departure, I packed an overnight bag in our bedroom while Ike watched TV in the living room. I made sure to include enough clothes and toiletries to make the trip look real, even though I'd only be 20 minutes away at a hotel. The next morning, I kissed her goodbye with the same distant affection I'd been showing for weeks, the kind of kiss that's more habit than feeling. She told me to drive safely and text her when I arrived, her voice cheerful in a way that made my stomach turn. I drove to a hotel on the other side of town, checked in under my own name, and set up my laptop on the desk to monitor the security camera feeds. The room was generic and impersonal, with beige walls and a view of the parking lot, but it would serve its purpose. Within 3 hours of my departure, I watched through the camera feed as Aiki pulled out her phone and called her mother. They spoke in rapid Japanese, and I turned up the volume on my laptop to catch every word. Aiki told her mother that Jason was coming over tomorrow night, that everything was set up perfectly. Her mother's voice came through the speaker with a note of caution, saying something felt off about my recent behavior, that maybe Aiki should be more careful. But Aiki laughed and dismissed the concern completely. She said I was too stupid to figure anything out, that I was probably just stressed about becoming a father and had no idea what was really going on. Her mother seemed to accept this explanation, and they moved on to discussing what Aiki should cook for Jason's visit. I closed my laptop and stared at the bland hotel wall, letting her words wash over me one more time before I documented everything and sent the file to Wallace. The next morning, I opened my work laptop and logged into the remote system, setting up spreadsheets and reports on one monitor while the security camera feeds played on the other. Every hour, I switched to the camera app and watched Aiki move through our house like she was performing a play I'd already read. She made breakfast around 9, scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table. She watched TV on the couch for most of the afternoon, some reality show I could see flickering on the screen. Around 1, she heated up leftovers and ate them standing at the counter. At 3, she had a video call on her laptop, and I zoomed in on the camera feed to see her smiling and laughing with someone whose face I couldn't quite make out. The whole day was so normal and boring that it made my stomach hurt. This was my wife doing regular wife things in our house, except she was planning to bring another man over tomorrow, and I was watching her like she was a stranger. I felt like I was looking at someone wearing Aiki's face, but I didn't know who was actually inside. Around 6, I closed the work files and got ready for my therapy appointment, driving across town to Devora's office instead of calling from the hotel like I usually did. Her office was in a small building with a waiting room that smelled like lavender, and she met me at the door with her usual calm expression. We sat in her office with the soft lighting and the white noise machine humming in the corner. I told her about the surveillance system and how I was spending my days watching Aiki through cameras she didn't know were recording audio. I explained that I was waiting for Jason to show up so I could document everything for the divorce. Devora listened without interrupting, then asked me what I would do if the evidence wasn't as dramatic as I was expecting. Her question made me pause because I hadn't really thought about it. I'd been so focused on catching Aiki in the worst possible moment that I hadn't considered what would happen if Jason just came over for dinner and they watched TV. What if there was no smoking gun, just ordinary cheating? Devora leaned forward a little and said something that shifted my whole perspective. She suggested I was framing this as a revenge mission, when really I was trying to protect myself from being legally and financially tied to another man's child. She said gathering evidence wasn't about punishment, it was about establishing truth, so I could make informed decisions about my future. The way she explained it made me feel less like some creepy guy spying on his wife, and more like someone taking reasonable steps to protect himself. I wasn't trying to destroy Aiki, I was trying to avoid being destroyed by her lies. When I left her office that night, I felt more grounded than I had in weeks, like I had permission to do what I was doing without drowning in guilt about it. The second day of my fake work trip started with more remote work and camera monitoring. I answered emails and attended a video conference call while keeping one eye on the feeds from home. Aiki seemed more energetic that day, cleaning the kitchen and doing laundry. Around 5, she took a shower and changed into nicer clothes, which made my pulse speed up because I knew what was coming. At 7 exactly, the doorbell camera showed Jason walking up to our front door carrying paper bags that looked like takeout and a bottle of wine tucked under his arm. I watched Aiki open the door and Jason kissed her right there in the doorway. Not a quick peck, but a real kiss that lasted several seconds. His hand went to her pregnant belly and rested there like he had every right to touch her. They walked into the living room, and I switched camera views to follow them. They settled on the couch and unpacked the takeout, some kind of Chinese food from the containers I could see. Their body language was so comfortable and familiar, the way they leaned into each other and shared food off the same plate. This wasn't a first date or a nervous affair, this was two people who had done this before. Probably many times. They were playing house in my actual house, sitting on my couch, eating at my coffee table, acting like this was their life together. I watched them eat and talk for about an hour, unable to hear what they were saying, but seeing how relaxed they both looked. Then I had to close the laptop because my chest felt tight and my hands were shaking. The intimate domesticity of watching them together was worse than I'd imagined. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, walking circles around the hotel parking lot in the cold night air. Cars drove past on the main road, and I focused on breathing slowly, reminding myself over and over that this evidence was necessary. I needed this documentation for the divorce, for the paternity challenge, for everything that was coming. The pain I felt right now was the price of protecting my future. After about 20 minutes, I went back inside and checked my phone, seeing a text from Maria asking if I was available to talk. I called her back and she told me she'd finished her background research on Aiki's family finances. Aiki's mother had filed for bankruptcy 7 years ago and still carried significant credit card debt based on the public records Maria had accessed. This information helped explain some of the pressure Aiki might feel to secure financial stability through me, though it didn't excuse anything she'd done. Maria said this context about her mother's money problems might be useful if we ended up in mediation, showing a pattern of financial desperation in the family. I thanked her and made notes about everything she'd told me. On the third day, I packed up my hotel room and drove home in the afternoon, timing my arrival for after I'd seen Jason leave on the security cameras. I pulled into the driveway around 4 and walked in through the front door with my overnight bag. Aiki came out of the kitchen and hugged me, asking how the training went. I gave her boring details about conference rooms and PowerPoint presentations about new software systems, all completely made up. She seemed relaxed and happy, probably relieved that her visit with Jason had gone undetected. We made dinner together and she talked about her day, mentioning she'd cleaned the house and watched some shows, carefully leaving out the part about her boyfriend spending the evening. That night after we got ready for bed, Aiki moved closer to me and put her hand on my chest in a way that made her intentions clear. I rolled away slightly and told her I was exhausted from the drive and the long training sessions. The thought of physical contact with her made my skin crawl, like my body knew the truth even while I was pretending ignorance. She looked hurt for a second but didn't push it, just turned over and went to sleep. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling and counting down the weeks until the baby would be born and I could finally end this charade. The next morning, I called Wallace and scheduled a meeting to review the security footage. In his office later that day, I showed him selected clips of Jason arriving, kissing Aiki and spending the evening at our house. Wallace watched carefully and took notes, confirming that Jason's presence combined with the video call logs and Matt's written statement established a clear pattern of ongoing deception. He reminded me that in our state, adultery had limited impact on divorce proceedings, which frustrated me because I had all this evidence that felt important, but wasn't actually going to change much legally. The real issue was going to be the paternity challenge and any financial claims Aiki might make based on our marriage. Wallace pulled out a legal pad and started drafting what he called a post-birth action plan. He explained that the plan included immediate paternity testing as soon as the baby was born, filing for legal separation within days of getting the results, and requesting temporary orders about property division and finances. The most important part was that I absolutely could not sign any birth certificate or acknowledgement of paternity forms at the hospital. Wallace stressed this multiple times, saying I needed to explicitly request DNA testing before acknowledging any parental rights or responsibilities. He warned me this would be the hardest moment, because Aiki would have just given birth, and I'd be refusing to sign papers while she was vulnerable and emotional. But it was legally necessary to protect myself from being presumed the father under state law. I nodded and took notes on everything he said, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over me like a heavy blanket. I spent the next afternoon buried in the hospital websites and medical forums, reading everything I could find about paternity testing procedures. The information was straightforward enough. Hospitals could collect DNA samples right after birth using a simple cheek swab from the baby and the supposed father. Standard processing took 3 to 5 days, which felt like an eternity when I imagined waiting in that limbo while Aiki recovered and everyone assumed I was the father. But there was an expedited option, results in 24 to 48 hours for an extra fee. I didn't even hesitate before deciding that was the route I'd take. The cost didn't matter when weighed against spending even one extra day trapped in uncertainty, pretending to celebrate a child that might not be mine, while Aiki's family watched and waited for me to sign documents that would legally bind me to another man's baby. I bookmarked 3 different testing services and emailed the information to Wallace, asking him to confirm which one the hospital used and whether I needed to arrange anything in advance. His response came within an hour, telling me he'd contact the hospital directly to set up the testing protocol and make sure the staff knew not to present me with any paternity acknowledgement forms until the results came back. Reading his email gave me a strange sense of relief, like I was finally taking concrete steps instead of just gathering evidence and waiting. That Friday, Aiki's mother arrived for the weekend with 2 suitcases and a bag full of baby clothes she'd been collecting. I watched from the kitchen as she hugged Aiki in the doorway, speaking rapid Japanese about how excited she was and how big Aiki's belly had gotten. They moved into the living room and I brought them tea, playing my role as the attentive husband while studying their dynamic with new awareness. Her mother was controlling in a way I'd noticed before, but never really analyzed, constantly touching Aiki's stomach and offering advice about everything from sleeping positions to what foods to avoid. Aiki responded to each suggestion with either immediate agreement or subtle rebellion depending on her mood, and I could see the pattern of their relationship playing out in real time. What struck me most was how her mother touched Aiki's belly constantly, her hands always reaching for that swollen curve, but she barely looked at me during the entire afternoon. When she did make eye contact, it lasted maybe a second before she glanced away, and I understood she couldn't quite face the person she'd helped her daughter deceive. I kept my expression neutral and brought them snacks, acting like I didn't notice the guilt written across her face every time I entered the room. Saturday evening, Robert came over for dinner, and the four of us sat around the table while he carved a roast he'd brought. The conversation stayed light at first, talk about the weather and some project Robert was working on in his garage, but then he mentioned something that made everyone go quiet. He'd been setting up a college fund for his future grandchild, putting aside money every month since we'd announced the pregnancy, and he wanted to know if we had any preferences about how the account should be structured. The table went completely silent, except for the sound of his knife against the cutting board. I saw Ike and her mother exchange a look across the table, a quick glance that lasted maybe 2 seconds but communicated everything. They both knew this baby might not be Robert's biological grandchild, that all his generous planning and excited preparation might be for a child who had no blood connection to him. The weight of their deception suddenly felt bigger than just what they'd done to me. It extended to Robert, this kind man who'd welcomed me into his family and treated me like a son. He kept talking about the fund, explaining compound interest and asking if we wanted to add to it ourselves, completely unaware of the tension crackling around him. I forced myself to respond normally, thanking him for his generosity and saying we'd definitely contribute once the baby arrived. Ike's mother excused herself to use the bathroom, and I caught the shine of tears in her eyes as she left the table. After dinner, I asked Robert if I could talk to him about something, using work decisions as my excuse. We went out to the garage where he kept his woodworking tools and half-finished projects, the air smelling like sawdust and varnish. He listened carefully as I made up questions about career advancement and work-life balance, giving me fatherly advice about prioritizing family and not letting ambition consume me. Standing there surrounded by his tools and hearing his genuine concern in his voice, I felt overwhelmed by the urge to tell him everything. The words were right there in my throat, ready to spill out about Ike's affair and Matt and the Japanese conversations where they'd mocked me. But Wallace's warnings echoed in my head about controlling the timing and method of disclosure, about not letting emotion drive my strategy. So I swallowed the truth and nodded along with Robert's guidance, accepting his wisdom about balance and family, while knowing that very soon I'd have to shatter his world with information that would break his heart. He clapped me on the shoulder and told me I was going to be a great father, and I had to turn away and pretend to examine a table saw so he wouldn't see my face. Over the next few weeks, Ike moved into her 3rd trimester, and everything got harder for her physically. She complained constantly about back pain that woke her up at night, ankles so swollen her regular shoes didn't fit, and insomnia that left her exhausted and irritable. I provided practical support like heating pads and extra pillows, helping her get comfortable in bed and making sure she had everything she needed, but I kept emotional distance that I couldn't quite hide. She noticed, commenting several times that I seemed different or distracted, asking if something was wrong at work, or if I was having second thoughts about becoming a father. Each time she asked, I blamed work stress and nervousness about the baby, giving her explanations that were technically true, even if they weren't the real reason for my distance. The truth was, I couldn't connect with her anymore, couldn't pretend intimacy or affection when I knew what she'd done and was still doing. Every touch felt wrong. Every conversation felt like a performance, and maintaining the facade exhausted me more than any physical labor could. The prenatal class happened on a Tuesday evening at the hospital where Ike would eventually deliver. We sat in a circle with 6 other couples while an instructor demonstrated breathing techniques and labor positions, everyone else seeming genuinely excited and connected. I felt like an actor in a play, going through motions that had no authentic meaning behind them. The instructor asked partners to practice supportive touch, showing us how to apply pressure to the lower back during contractions. I placed my hands on Ike's back with clinical detachment, following the technical instructions but feeling nothing, and she turned her head to give me a confused look. The other couples were laughing and joking, the men making nervous comments about fainting in the delivery room, while their wives rolled their eyes affectionately. I stayed silent through most of the class, only speaking when directly addressed, and Ike kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. On the drive home, she asked again if I was okay, and I told her I was just processing everything and feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility. She seemed to accept this explanation, reaching over to squeeze my hand, and I let her hold it while keeping my eyes on the road. Maria called me the following Monday to say her final investigation report was complete. I met her at her office that afternoon, and she handed me a bound document that laid out everything in clear, organized detail. The timeline of Ike's affair with Matt, including dates and locations where they'd met. The $5,000 payment Matt had made, with bank records showing the transfer. The ongoing relationship with Jason, documented through surveillance footage from my home security system and the video call logs I'd pulled from our router. Witness statements from Matt admitting to the affair and the payment. The family gathering recordings where Ike and her mother had discussed the deception in Japanese. Maria had organized it all into a narrative that could be presented to a judge if necessary, complete with exhibits and supporting documentation. I flipped through the pages feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness, seeing my wife's betrayal reduced to bullet points and timestamps. Maria warned me again that Wallace was still cautious about relying too heavily on the surveillance footage, explaining that some judges viewed that kind of evidence negatively, even when it was legally obtained. But she'd done her job thoroughly, giving me every piece of information I might need to protect myself legally and financially. That week, I had a therapy session with Devora, where she asked me a question that stopped me cold. What outcome would actually satisfy me at this point? I sat there in her office trying to articulate an answer and realized I didn't want Ike to suffer or be destroyed. I just wanted to be free. Free from the legal obligation of raising another man's child, free from the financial responsibility of supporting someone who'd deceived me, free from being mocked in a language I supposedly didn't understand. Devora helped me work through this, asking questions that clarified my actual goals versus the revenge fantasies I'd been entertaining. She pointed out that my evidence gathering had been about self-protection, not punishment, and that distinction mattered both legally and emotionally. By the end of the session, I could articulate clearly that I wanted a clean separation with my dignity intact, not destruction or public humiliation. This clarity helped me refine my approach with Wallace, focusing on legal protection rather than dramatic exposure. I left Devora's office feeling more grounded than I had in weeks, like I'd finally separated my legitimate needs from my anger. I created a new email account that evening, using a secure provider, and began forwarding important documents to it. Financial records showing our joint accounts and Ike's spending patterns since she'd quit her job. The security system footage of Jason's visits. Maria's complete investigation report with all exhibits. Wallace's legal strategy memos and the draft separation papers. Everything I might need if Ike tried to delete or destroy evidence once she realized I knew the truth. I also sent access credentials to both Maria and Wallace, giving them permission to retrieve these files if anything happened to my primary accounts or if I became unable to access them myself. The process took over an hour, carefully organizing files and making sure everything uploaded correctly, but I felt better knowing there were multiple backups. Wallace had warned me that Ike might try to lock me out of joint accounts or hide assets once separation papers were filed, and this email archive gave me insurance against that possibility. Ike's due date was now just 2 weeks away, and the house filled with baby supplies that felt like props in a theater production. I spent a Saturday afternoon assembling the crib Robert had bought, following the instructions and tightening screws while knowing I'd probably never use this furniture. The car seat sat in its box in the garage, waiting to be installed. Tiny clothes hung in the nursery closet, organized by size. I moved through these tasks mechanically, setting up a home for a baby I wouldn't be raising, and the disconnect between my actions and my knowledge created a dreamlike state where nothing felt quite real. Ike came in while I was working on the crib and stood in the doorway watching me, her hand resting on her belly. She asked if I was excited and I said yes, keeping my voice steady. She moved closer and put her arms around me from behind, or tried to given her size, and I stood there letting her hold me while staring at the half-assembled crib and counting down the days until I could finally end this performance. Wallace's email arrived on a Thursday morning with the subject line, "Documents for Review." I opened the attachment and spent the next 2 hours reading through legal language that made everything feel suddenly real in a way the surveillance footage never had. The petition for legal separation laid out grounds and requested temporary orders. The paternity challenge document formally stated my refusal to acknowledge parentage and requested DNA testing to establish biological father. Each paragraph was clinical and precise, turning months of betrayal into numbered clauses and whereas statements. I made notes in the margins, mostly small wording changes that Wallace had suggested I review. One section requested that I not be held financially responsible for medical costs related to the birth or postnatal care. Another asked the court to restrain Ike from selling or hiding marital assets during the separation period. I approved everything with my edits and emailed Wallace back, authorizing him to file the moment we had paternity test results. The documents sat in a folder on his desk, ready to go, just waiting for scientific proof of what I already knew. 3 nights later, I woke to Ike shaking my shoulder. Her face was tight with pain and she told me the contractions had started. I checked my phone and saw it was 2:17 a.m. I timed the next contraction and then the one after that, confirming they were 7 minutes apart like the prenatal class had taught us to watch for. I got up and moved through the house with focused energy, packing her hospital bag with the items from the checklist we'd prepared weeks ago. Comfortable clothes, toiletries, phone charger, the going-home outfit for the baby. Ike gripped the bathroom counter during another contraction, and I stood behind her, applying pressure to her lower back the way we'd practiced. When the contraction passed, I helped her to the car and drove to the hospital with both hands steady on the wheel. She reached over and grabbed my hand during the next contraction, squeezing hard enough that my fingers went numb. I squeezed back because whatever else was true between us, she was still a human being in real pain, and I couldn't just turn off basic compassion. The hospital admitted her quickly and got her settled in a delivery room. The contractions were getting stronger and closer together, and I stayed right beside the bed helping her breathe through each one. The breathing techniques from the prenatal class actually helped, and I counted out loud while she focused on the rhythm. When she wanted ice chips, I got them. When she needed the nurse, I called. When the doctor came to check her progress, I asked questions about pain management options because Ike had told me weeks ago she wanted an epidural. The medical staff moved around us with practiced efficiency, monitoring the baby's heart rate and Ike's vital signs. Around hour 8, Robert and Ike's mother arrived. Robert hugged me and asked how she was doing, and I gave him updates on centimeters dilated and the epidural that had been placed an hour before. The four of us settled into a vigil that probably looked completely normal to anyone watching. Robert sat in the corner chair reading news on his phone. Ike's mother stood near the bed speaking quietly to her daughter in Japanese. I stayed close to Ike, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and helping her shift positions when her back hurt. Several times I caught Robert's eye across the room, and the warmth and gratitude I saw there made my chest physically ache because I knew that look would be gone soon. The baby was born at 6:47 p.m. after 2 hours of pushing that left Ike exhausted and shaking. The doctor announced it was a boy and called out the weight at 7 pounds 3 ounces. The medical team cleaned him quickly and then placed him on Ike's chest for skin-to-skin contact. The room filled with tears and congratulations. Robert was crying and taking photos. Ike's mother was speaking rapid Japanese about how beautiful he was. The nurses were smiling and praising Ike for her hard work. I stood slightly apart from the bed, watching this moment that should have been the happiest of my life, but felt more like attending a funeral. The baby was making small noises and moving his tiny hands. Ike was crying and smiling at the same time. Everyone was so focused on the new life in the room that no one noticed I hadn't moved closer or reached out to touch him. About 30 minutes later, after the medical team had finished their immediate postpartum checks, a nurse came in with a clipboard. She smiled at me and started explaining the birth certificate paperwork, pointing to the lines where I would need to sign to be listed as the legal father. I looked at the form and then at the nurse and told her quietly that I wanted to arrange paternity testing before I signed anything. My voice was calm, but the words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Ike's head snapped toward me, her exhausted face suddenly alert with an expression I'd never seen before. Her mother started speaking rapidly in Japanese, asking what was happening. What did I just say? I turned to face her and responded in fluent Japanese that I would like to establish paternity before accepting legal responsibility for the child. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized I'd understood every word she and Ike had spoken for months. The room went completely silent, except for the small noises the baby was making. Ike stared at me, and I watched her expression cycle through shock, then fear, then something calculating as her mind raced to figure out how much I knew and how long I'd known it. Her mother's face had gone white, and she gripped the bed rail like she might fall over. Robert looked between all of us with growing confusion, clearly sensing something was very wrong but not understanding what. I kept my eyes on Ike and repeated in English that I was requesting a paternity test, which was my legal right as the presumed father. My voice stayed level and factual, giving away nothing about the months of surveillance and evidence gathering. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting family drama during what should have been a happy moment. The nurse cleared her throat and explained in a professional tone that the hospital could collect DNA samples for paternity testing. She pulled out a different form and started describing the process while Ike just stared at me with tears running down her face. The nurse mentioned they offered expedited processing that could provide results in 24 to 48 hours instead of the standard 3 to 5 days. I told her I wanted the fastest option available and I would pay whatever the additional cost was. Ike started crying harder, and I couldn't tell if the tears were from exhaustion or pain or fear or maybe even real remorse. Her mother was speaking to her in Japanese again, asking what she should do, but I ignored both of them. The nurse looked very uncomfortable now and said she would get the materials needed for the DNA collection and bring back the consent forms. When the nurse returned about 10 minutes later, she had 2 sealed collection kits. She explained the process and then swabbed the inside of the baby's cheek, sealing that sample in its container with labels and my signature as witness. Then she swabbed the inside of my cheek and sealed that sample separately. Both containers went into a larger envelope that would go to the lab. She had me sign consent forms and initial several places confirming I understood the process and the costs. When all the paperwork was done, I told Ike that I would be staying somewhere else until the results came back. I mentioned that I'd already packed some of my things from the house. Her mother tried to speak to me in Japanese, maybe forgetting in her panic that I'd just revealed my fluency, or maybe not caring anymore. I ignored her completely and turned to Robert instead. I asked Robert if he would step into the hallway with me. He nodded and followed me out of the delivery room into the bright fluorescent lighting of the hospital corridor. We walked a little ways down the hall away from the room, and I turned to face him. I told him as gently as I could that there were questions about the baby's paternity. I didn't give him all the details or offer to play him the surveillance footage I had on my phone. I just explained that I had reason to believe the child might not be mine biologically, and that I needed to establish the truth before accepting legal responsibility. Robert's face just crumpled. He leaned back against the wall like his legs wouldn't hold him up anymore. His hand came up to cover his mouth and he closed his eyes. Robert opened his eyes and asked me directly if I thought Ike had cheated on me. I told him yes, I had evidence of an affair, and I believed the biological father was someone named Matt. He closed his eyes again and took several deep breaths, his chest rising and falling like he was trying to steady himself. Then he asked if I was certain about this. I told him about the conversations in Japanese that I'd understood, about the private investigator's findings, about Matt's admission regarding the $5,000 payment he'd made to avoid responsibility. I watched Robert's face as I spoke, and he seemed to age 10 years in the space of 10 minutes. His shoulders sagged and new lines appeared around his eyes and mouth. When I finished talking, he just stood there against the wall, staring at the floor, and trying to process that his daughter had lied to everyone, and that the grandchild he'd been so excited about wasn't biologically his grandchild at all. I left the hospital that night and drove straight to the hotel where I'd been staying during my fake work trip. The room felt different now, less like a hiding place and more like a waiting room for my entire future. I plugged my phone in and opened my laptop, creating a folder for the paternity results that would arrive in the next few days. My phone buzzed almost immediately with a text from Ike asking where I was going. I typed back that I needed space and would be in touch about her recovery. She called twice within 10 minutes, but I let both calls go to voicemail. The third call came from her mother's number and I blocked it without listening. Maria texted around 10 p.m. asking if I was okay and if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, just waiting, and she promised to check in tomorrow. Wallace sent an email confirming he had the separation papers ready to file the moment we had DNA confirmation. He included a draft of the temporary orders requesting property division and asset protection. I read through the legal language 3 times, making sure I understood every paragraph. My phone buzzed again with another call from Ike. I turned the sound off and set it face down on the nightstand. The next morning, I woke up to 7 missed calls and a dozen text messages. Most were from Ike asking me to come back and talk. 2 were from her mother in broken English saying I was being cruel. 1 was from Robert asking if I was safe and if we could talk when I was ready. I responded only to Robert, telling him I appreciated his concern and would call him soon. I spent the day working from the hotel room, taking video calls with my laptop camera angled to hide the generic hotel furniture behind me. My boss asked if everything was okay with the baby, and I said there were some complications we were sorting out. Between meetings, I checked my email every 15 minutes, refreshing the inbox even though I knew the lab said results would take 3 days minimum. Maria called around lunch and I answered. She asked how I was holding up and I told her honestly that I felt numb. She said that was normal, that I was in shock and that the waiting was often harder than the knowing. I thanked her for checking in, and she promised to call again tomorrow. Ike texted that she was scared and didn't understand why I was doing this. I didn't respond. Her mother texted from a different number saying I was destroying the family. I blocked that one too. Wallace called in the evening to go over the timeline once we had results. He explained that service of papers would happen within hours of filing, that Ike would be served at her mother's house where she was recovering. He asked if I was prepared for her reaction, and I said yes. The third day started with my alarm at 6 a.m., even though I'd barely slept. I checked my email before I even got out of bed and saw it. The subject line read, DNA test results, and my hand shook as I opened the attachment. The document was clinical and official, full of technical language about genetic markers and probability calculations. But the conclusion was clear in bold text at the bottom. Based on the genetic analysis, the probability of paternity is 0.0001%, effectively excluding the tested man as the biological father. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed staring at the screen. I'd known this was coming, had been certain of it for weeks, but seeing the scientific proof made it real in a way that surveillance footage and private investigators never had. This was evidence that would hold up in court, that would protect me legally, that would end my marriage and erase any obligation to this child. I felt relief wash over me, then grief right behind it. This was the future I'd imagined for 3 years, the baby I'd prepared for, the family I'd wanted, and it was all built on lies. I forwarded the email to Wallace with a 1-word message. File. Then I forwarded it to Maria with a thank you for her help. Then I sat in the quiet hotel room and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Wallace called 2 hours later to confirm the papers were filed and that a process server was on the way to Aiki's mother's house. He explained that the documents included the legal separation, the paternity disestablishment, and the request for temporary orders. Ike would have 30 days to respond, but the temporary orders hearing would be scheduled within 2 weeks. He asked if I wanted him to be present when I called Robert, and I said no. I needed to do that myself. I pulled up Robert's number and stared at it for 5 minutes before I could make myself press call. He answered on the second ring. I told him the results were in and asked if he wanted me to send him a copy. His voice was quiet when he said no, that he believed me, that he didn't need to see the numbers. I heard him take a shaky breath and then his voice broke. He asked if I was certain about the father being Matt, and I said yes, that Matt had admitted to the affair and the payment to avoid responsibility. Robert was silent for a long time, and I could hear him crying. He finally asked if I planned to tell Matt about the results. I said I was considering it but hadn't decided yet, that Matt had a right to know, but I wasn't sure if it was my responsibility to tell him. Robert said he understood and that he was sorry, that he'd raised his daughter better than this and didn't know where he'd gone wrong. I told him this wasn't his fault, and that I hoped we could stay in touch. He said he'd like that, and then the call ended. 3 days after the papers were served, Ike texted asking if I would meet her in person. I agreed to a coffee shop near the hospital, a neutral public place where neither of us could make a scene. I got there early and sat in a corner booth facing the door. She walked in 15 minutes later looking smaller than I remembered. Her face was tired and her clothes hung loose on her postpartum body. She spotted me and walked over slowly, sliding into the booth across from me. I waited for her to speak first, but she just stared at her hands. Finally, I started talking in a calm, measured voice. I told her I knew about Matt, about the affair, about the $5,000 he paid her. I told her I knew about Jason and the plans she'd made during my work trip. I told her about all the conversations in Japanese where she'd mocked me and laughed about extracting money from me. Her face went pale and she opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I kept going. I told her I'd understood every word she and her mother had said from the very beginning, that I spoke fluent Japanese and had been hiding it because I was embarrassed about my anime phase. I told her I had recordings, witness statements, and now DNA proof that the baby wasn't mine. She started to shake her head and I held up my hand. I wasn't done. Ike tried to deny everything at first, saying the recordings were fake or that I'd misunderstood the Japanese. I just looked at her and waited. Then she switched to minimizing, saying it was just one mistake with Matt and that Jason was just a friend. I kept my face neutral and said nothing. Then she started blaming her mother, saying her mom had pressured her and given her bad advice about securing financial stability. I still didn't respond. Finally, she started crying and apologizing, saying she'd made terrible choices and that she was sorry and that she still loved me. I listened to all of it without interrupting, letting her cycle through every approach until she ran out of things to say. Then I spoke. I explained that the legal process was moving forward, that I wouldn't be signing any paternity documents, and that she needed to contact Matt about his responsibilities as the biological father. She asked through tears if there was any chance we could work things out, if we could go to counseling, or if I could forgive her. I told her honestly that the trust was completely destroyed, that I couldn't be married to someone who'd lied to me in a language she thought I didn't understand, who'd mocked me with her family, who'd planned to keep extracting money from me while seeing other men. She put her face in her hands and sobbed. I stood up, left money for both our coffees, and walked out. I contacted Matt through Maria the next day, sending him the paternity results and Ike's contact information via secure email. I wrote that I wasn't trying to force him into any particular course of action, but that he deserved to know the truth about his biological child. I explained that I'd legally disestablished paternity, and that Ike would need to work out support arrangements directly with him. Maria forwarded his response 2 days later. Matt said he needed time to process this information and consult with his own lawyer before deciding what to do. He thanked me for letting him know and apologized for the whole situation. I wrote back through Maria that I understood and that I had no hard feelings toward him personally. The affair was between him and Ike, and the child support was between him and the state. I was done with all of it. 2 months later, I was living in a modest apartment across town, a 1-bedroom place with decent light and a small balcony. I'd moved my stuff out of the house while Ike was staying with her mother, taking only what was mine and leaving everything related to the baby. The divorce proceedings were moving slowly through the court system, and Wallace said it would probably take another several months to finalize. I was attending therapy sessions with Devora every week, working through the betrayal and the grief and the anger. She was helping me separate the legitimate hurt from the destructive revenge fantasies, helping me build a life based on truth instead of deception. I'd enrolled in an advanced Japanese language class at the community college, finally admitting to people that I spoke the language and even explaining why I'd hidden it for so long. My classmates thought the story was wild, and several of them followed me on social media after I posted about it. Robert and I met for coffee every couple of weeks, 2 men processing grief and betrayal together. We didn't talk much about Ike or the baby, just sat together and shared the quiet understanding of people who'd both lost something. Our relationship would never be what it was when he thought I was going to be his son-in-law, but there was a respect between us that felt honest. I wasn't fine yet, and some days were harder than others. I'd wake up angry or sad or just numb, but I was free from the gaslighting and the mockery and the elaborate deception. I was building a life where I didn't have to pretend or hide or play dumb. That freedom was worth every bit of pain it took to get here. So yeah, that's it. Just one of those everyday stories that somehow sticks with you. Thanks for hanging out. It's always a good time having you here. Come back when you feel like catching up again.